Hello, everybody. I am Paul Cartledge, and I'm speaking to you not from Athens, as you might have thought, but from Cambridge. And I'm a senior research fellow at my college, Clare College, Cambridge. I'm a retired professor of Greek culture. And I'm very, very grateful to our stars of Classics for All, that is Alice, Hilary, Tom and Charlie, for both setting this event up and for inviting me to host it. I've been associated with, a supporter of, indeed a donor to Classics for All since its inception, which is now 10 years ago. And I sit on the development committee of CFA. And development, for those of you in the know, means fundraising. And so this is, among other things, of course, it's educational in the broad sense, but this is a fundraising event. So thanks to all of those, and thanks especially, of course, to you for signing up, for paying up, buying tickets, and if you have, giving additional donations and supporting our charity in general, the objects of which are very clearly stated on our website, Classics for All. And essentially what we try to do is introduce as many school children in the state or maintained sector as is humanly possible to either Greek language or Latin language, or some form of classical studies, classical civilization, ancient history, and or a combination of all those. As I say, we've been going for 10 years, and you've seen in the very short video a selection of the types of schools, the types of teachers, the types of pupils who've benefited hugely from this astonishing, I think, establishment. So for today's event, there are some housekeeping rules. You may submit questions using the Q&A box that I expect you'll find at the bottom of your screen. I shall start off with some questions to our first speaker, whom I'm going to introduce to you very shortly. But do please not hesitate to fire off questions, and I'll try to host and to select. We, of course, won't have time to answer them all, those that are interesting and understandable, both by me and by our speaker. Please also, if you have technical issues, use the chat box, also probably at the bottom of your screen, and that will go to somebody on the technical side who should be able to sort you out. Any comments or feedback in the longer term, anything that you want either to ask or indeed to comment upon for the benefit of the institution of Classics for All, please send by email. You'll find the address again online. Well, today is a game of two halves, very unequal halves, but nevertheless, there are two portions. First of all, my dear friend and colleague, Edith Hall, will be speaking to us. You will then ask questions, she will answer them, and that should go on to about 6:55, if all goes to plan. After that, there will be a second Q&A between Hilary Hodgson and Gemma Williams of Allerton Grange School. So please, if you are keen and interested to see an example of one particular school which has benefited particularly from our association, then do stay on after the Edith Hall bit of the event has finished. Well, now I'm going to introduce Edith, and it's not easy actually to pack what should be packed into a short space. We've known each other for over 30 years, but this is, I think, the first time I've had the privilege and pleasure of introducing her to you, or to any audience, in fact. I've participated in many events with Edith, but not before, I think, as chair. She's Professor of Classics at King's London. She's the founder of a campaign advocating classics education. She's now published more than 30 books on the ancient world and what we call reception, the way in which modern audiences of different sorts in different contexts have made something of what they've received from the ancient Greek and Roman or Greco-Roman or ancient Mediterranean worlds. She broadcasts frequently on radio and television. I've myself several times found myself seated next to her in a studio in Broadcasting House in the In Our Time slot, presided over by Melvyn Bragg. She works also as a consultant with professional theatres. She lectures all over the world, or did, before the coronavirus smashed that. And she publishes widely in both academic and mainstream journals and newspapers. She's been awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of St Andrews. Her latest book, and this is what we're really here to hear about today, is entitled A People's History of Classics, Class and Greco-Roman Antiquity in Britain, 1689 to 1939. It was published just over a year ago in March 2020. It's already won a prize and it's been longlisted for another prize. And this is what she said about today's talk. I'm just going to quote a little sentence or two. She'll be exploring the classical past, on the influence of it on the lives of working class people. And she will thereby challenge the prevailing assumption that working class culture was historically a classics-free zone. She will outline some of the struggles that non-elite Britons have been through in order to access the ancient Greeks and Romans between the Bill of Rights, 1689, and the outbreak of World War II, 1939. She will be giving vivid examples of those who succeeded, and she will demonstrate that classics historically was, and of course still is and will be, for all. Edith, over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was very touching, and thank you. I just have three things to say. One is I have to explain my appearance. I had a rather ghastly eye operation yesterday on my left eye, which is why the film that you're going to see, I recorded last week while I could still definitely read my lecture out. I wanted to get it in the bag. So I've had my retina glued on with some kind of surgical super glue, and my galloping myopia arrested and my cataracts cleaned out. My 21-year-old, who is very sad that there was no classics available at her comprehensive school, gave me the pirate badge because she thought it was stylish. The second thing to say is I haven't actually been awarded, it's a bit embarrassing, an honorary doctorate by St Andrews. I have been awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Athens, the Capodistrian, and I'm about to be awarded one by the University of Durham, but St Andrews hasn't yet decided that I'm worthy of such an incredible honour. And the third thing I just want to say is that all the research for this book, was done jointly with the wonderful Dr. Henry Stead of St Andrews University, which is, of course, one of the partners in the Advocating Classics Education project, and has done a very great deal of heroic work to bring classics to young people in the east of Scotland. So I don't want anybody thinking this was a monograph written just by me. It was an entirely a joint effort. So having said that, over to the actual film.
This is a historical perspective on non-elite access to classics in Britain. Last year, with Dr. Henry Stead of St Andrews University, and with much input from Professor Cartledge's close reading of the penultimate draft, I published a book entitled A People's History of Classics, Class and Greco-Roman Antiquity in Britain and Ireland, 1689 to 1939. The aim was to document the complex and varied ways in which non-elite people in these islands accessed ancient Greece and Rome and their languages from the Glorious Revolution, at about the time that the subject area we know as classics was first invented, until the run-up to the Butler Education Act 1944. And the books also formed the intellectual backdrop to the campaign I set up with Dr. Arlene Holmes Henderson, ACE, or Advocating Classics Education, which campaigns for the expansion of the provision of classical subjects in British state secondary education. And today I identified 10 ways in which the admirable project of Classics for All, improving access to classical subjects in education so it's available to all our youngsters, can perhaps learn from and be encouraged by the past. So first, there's always been a great deal of interest in the ancient Greeks and Romans across the social spectrum. Our research in remote archives often uncovered an encounter with the ancient world which took our breath away. One was finding the lesson preparation of Isabel Dawson, a primary school teacher in the tiny town of Buckie on the Moray Firth, who just before World War I was teaching her little charges the Greek alphabet alongside the 3 R's and domestic science. And this book asks how workers gained access to classical texts, ideas and materials, and how the contact benefited them, affected their lives and their attitudes. Now, the idea that classics is an elite subject has always been and remains pervasive, but it's simply not true. Just because some people and institutions have used it to exclude the majority of the population and to emphasise socio-political hierarchies does not mean that it's inherently elitist, nor that it can't be used in manifold progressive causes, from abolition of slavery to democratic reform, women's suffrage, gay rights and utopian thinking. Our book refutes wholesale the argument that classical education must be intrinsically elitist or reactionary. It has been the curriculum of empire, but it can be the curriculum of liberation. So we emphasise the historical instrumentality of the legacy of Greece and Rome in progressive and enlightened causes, both personal and political. And second, there's no logical basis to the idea that there's a conflict or contradiction between approaching the Greco-Roman world through learning the actual ancient languages or through translations or material culture. Criticism of courses that approach the ancient world in translation serve only to impede mass access and cement ancient and unhelpful prejudices. Thomas Jefferson, who found the idea of the pursuit of happiness in Aristotle, wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia that the one real goal of education was equipping people to defend their freedom. And he argued that history, which must include for him ancient history, was the subject which made citizens so equipped. And to stay free requires also comparison of constitutions, fearlessness about change, critical, lateral, relativist thinking across time and cultures. The ancient Mediterranean world offers an ideal context for the development of these forms of intellectual understanding and skills. And Matthew Arnold, who'd observed hundreds of schools in France and Germany, as well as in Britain, as one of Her Majesty's inspectors, actually criticised the excessive linguistic emphasis of contemporary classics, especially teaching, in a talk he gave at Eton while advocating the importance of studying the entirety of Greco-Roman civilization. He said that an overly narrow linguistic emphasis actually destroys the precious facility to conceive that Greco-Roman world, which he said was so mighty a factor in our own world, our own life, as a whole of which we can trace the sequence and the sense and the connection with ourselves. So we were actually delighted to discover a marvellous English prose essay published in 1700. It's the preface to an anonymous translation from ancient Greek, Lucian's Charon. The dialogue itself is one of Lucian's most elegant little dramas. Charon ascends to the world of the living, and he's taken on a whistle-stop tour of archaic civilization by Hermes. And this 1700 preface is an original dialogue between two men on the theme of studying classical literature in translation. The arguments put forward by Philenor are diverse and cogent. He points out that translation of Greek masterpieces was good enough for the Romans, since Cicero, Ennius, Pacuvius and so on had all been translators. On the contrary, says Philenor, we should think that nothing in the world has a greater tendency to its advancement. Those rich treasures of knowledge and learning amongst the ancients are no longer now locked up in unintelligible words. Translating texts by the ancient Greeks and Romans into English, he says, has to our country brought all they writ and all they thought. Men may now familiarly converse with the wits of Greece and Rome. For now every man may hear Plutarch, Tully, Homer, Virgil, Theocritus, Horace, Ovid and innumerable others speaking in his own tongue the wonderful works of God and nature, the admirable productions of wit and fancy, and whatever else may yield a grateful satisfaction to noble and ingenious minds. Moreover, enjoying ancient authors in one's mother tongue encourages people to study Greek and Latin. One of the translator's aims, he says, has been to excite the desire of readers to improve their knowledge of the ancient languages, especially in those who have the opportunity, leisure and financial support to do so. And I, like many other universities, can absolutely vouch for the truth of this. Our students who arrive excited by reading Greek drama or Virgil or Arrian or Livy or Suetonius in classical civilization and ancient history courses soon catch up out of sheer enthusiasm with those lucky enough to have had access to the ancient language, which usually is only because they attended private school. So many of the individuals we studied started relatively late but learned incredible speed. And that helped us to understand that it's never too late to get the classics bug. And in looking at the history of reading in translation, we came to acknowledge the peerless contribution made by Dryden's Virgil and especially Pope's Homer, as well as other cheap translations, to the availability of ancient authors to all. Pope's translations, which were so often reprinted that they became available for tiny sums on the second-hand book market, brought Homer to a far larger audience, including workers and women, than had ever had the opportunity to learn Greek. Take Esther Easton, a Jedburgh gardener's wife, visited by Robert Burns in 1787. He recorded she was a very remarkable woman for reciting poetry of all kinds. She can repeat almost everything she's ever read, particularly Pope's Homer from end to end. In short, is a woman of extraordinary abilities. And Pope's Homer captured the childhood imagination of another Scot, Hugh Miller. And now he grew up to become a world-famous geologist. But even as a boy, he saw the Iliad as incomparable literature and reminds us how pleasure can attract young people towards classics if they're not put off. He wrote in My Schools and Schoolmasters in 1854 that he'd learned early, no other writer can cast a javelin with the force of Homer. The missiles went whizzing athwart his pages, and I could see the momentary gleam of steel ere it buried itself deep in brass and bull hide. Now, third, we also came to understand the importance of publishers with a social conscience and a commitment to mass education. After many hours winding yarn for a Leicester cardigan jacket weaver, Tom Barclay, who was the son of Irish immigrants, that his dad was a rag and bone man, revelled in his collection of second-hand, often tattered books kept in a clothes basket. He scoured market schools for discarded school books and popular educational journals. Many a studious youth, he reflects, has blessed another publisher, namely Cassell, for bringing out the popular educator. And John Cassell himself joked that the country is positively threatened with cooks and housemaids and nurses and footmen, grooms, mechanics and peasants that will actually have more information, intelligence, piety and morality than the kings, lords, clergy and gentry of the olden time. Now, Castle began life himself as a labourer in a Manchester cotton mill and velveteen factory, but he was apprenticed at 16 to a joiner in Salford. But at 20, he walked out away from the poverty of his childhood to London, married, opened a tea and coffee business. And he then ventured into the world of educational publishing for the purpose, as he wrote in 1851, of issuing a series of publications calculated to advance the moral and social well-being of the working classes. In 1852, he launched his famous Popular Educator, which immediately became the staple reading of the working class autodidact. And Castle's alumni included the future Prime Minister David Lloyd George and the workhouse boy who, with the help of a Wesleyan night school, became Oxford Professor of Comparative Philology, Joseph Wright. Thomas Burt, a Northumberland miner, worked as a trapper at Haswell Pit, but then became, much later, councillor to King Edward VII and father of the House of Commons. And Burt considered Castle's publication the chief handbook in my self-instruction. He remembers sitting at the end of the table, armed with the Popular Educator and a Latin dictionary, while with slate and pencil, he wrote, I translated as best I could the Latin lessons into English and the English into Latin. And these Latin words, with their English meanings, committed to memory. Now, the philological brains behind Castle's entrepreneurial brawn belonged to the Reverend John Relly Beard. A devout Unitarian minister, he opened a school in Salford and later a very important college for training Unitarian teachers and preachers. He was a crucial force behind the movement for popular education. And by the time he contributed the weekly lessons in Latin, Greek and English literature to Castle's Popular Educator, Beard had already produced Latin Made Easy in 1848 and demonstrated his political radicalism by publishing a biography of the leader of the Haiti slave rebellion, Toussaint Louverture. Now, in his Greek lessons, Beard writes, my purpose is to simplify the study of Greek so as to throw open to all who are earnest in the great work of self-culture. Nor need any industrious person of ordinary capacity despair of acquiring skill to read the New Testament, and, if he pleases and will persevere, he may then go on to an intimate acquaintance with Xenophon, Demosthenes, Thucydides, Homer, and the other Greek classics. So great inexpensive translation series played crucial roles as well. And they included Henry Bone's famed classical library of Greek and Roman classics, established in 1848, and that consisted of 79 classical titles. Then Castle & Co. launched the National Library, edited by the philanthropic UCL Professor of English Henry Morley. These were read, for example, by one Thomas Jones, an iron worker who could just about afford them, and smuggled these slim volumes into his iron plants, and he eventually became one of the most powerful civil servants in London, Deputy Secretary under Lloyd George, and he was considered indispensable by 3 subsequent Prime Ministers. There were even cheaper initiatives, such as the 6-penny Plutarch's Lives, that was edited by Ward, Lock & Co. in 1885, and the very thin volumes of William Thomas Stead's Books for the Bairns, a series launched in 1896 with Aesop's Fables. He was the son of an underemployed iron foundry worker and later an iron moulder himself. But Joseph Stamper remembers reading Stead's pamphlets in St Helens, Lancashire, especially stories from ancient Rome, which summarises tales from the Aeneid and Livy. He also read Homer, Pliny's Letters, and Aesop Fables. And it was Joseph Mallaby Dent's Everyman Library, however, which from 1906 took cheap reprint publishing and cross-class access to the Greco-Roman classics to another level altogether. Everyman published 1,000 titles in its first 50 years, and 46 are classical. They include most of the standard works of Greek and Roman philosophy, prose and history, from Marcus Aurelius, that was actually the first classical text released, through the dramas of Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides and Aristophanes, to the epics of Homer and Virgil. Dent was the son of a Darlington painter-decorator, and he wanted to run away with the travelling theatre, but after joining a mutual improvement society, caught the literature bug. Raised in a working-class house with 11 siblings and educated by Wesleyan Methodists, Dent used to sneak out to the old barn theatre in Darlington, where his threepenny coin bought him a gallery seat and transportation from the daily grind. Theatre broadened his cultural horizons. He was particularly enthralled by James Sheridan Knowles's Virginius, for, he wrote, it had a Roman setting and took me far away from things mundane into a world of imagination which has haunted me ever since. Now, fourth, our research has taught us never to underestimate anyone's ability to understand complicated authors. Dent's editor was Ernest Rhys, who began his life as a coal viewer at Langley Park, County Durham. And in the few years before he moved to London to live by his pen, he sought to enrich the leisure conditions and intellectual lives of his co-workers. To the consternation of his Conservative line manager, who considered mine workers to be interested only in drinking and gambling, he managed to establish a library in a derelict workers' cottage, and Plato's Republic was the first thing on the inaugural reading list. Fifth, it became clear that getting access to the ancient world in any serious and committed academic way required, as well as good luck and hard work, help from the more financially fortunate. 2 years into his apprenticeship to a Buckingham tailor, Robert Hill, intrigued by Latin epitaphs in his churchyard, acquired 2 beaten-up old language textbooks of Latin. But it was only the patronage of a kind teacher at Buckingham Free School, and then of 2 gentlemanly employees who lent him books and swapped Greek for fishing lessons. And lastly, of Joseph Spence, a scholarly clergyman and patron of underprivileged poets. It was only then that he got the education he needed to work as a school teacher, which is what he wanted. And Thomas Ruddiman, the near starving son of a Catholic Aberdeenshire tenant farmer, had to run away from home to compete and win a bursary at what was then King's College Aberdeen. But it was only by a completely random encounter with a philanthropic physician, Archibald Pitcairn, did he gain a post at the Advocates' Library at Edinburgh, and then publish his exceptional bestseller, The Rudiments of the Latin Tongue, in 1714, which, crucially, explained things in English. And the 2 great Georgian professors of Greek at Edinburgh, Andrew Dalzell and George Dunbar, were a carpenter's son spotted and financed by a friendly laird, and a gardener spotted by Dalzell himself once he'd made it, respectively. Free library provision made a huge difference to opportunity as well. That remarkable civil servant Thomas Jones, who we've met, was lucky enough to be born into the South Wales iron town of Rhymney, where in 1858 the Iron Company paid £3,000 to provide the town with a national school, a library and a reading room. And amongst the very first library loans were translations of Plutarch's Lives and Josephus' Jewish Wars, as well as Gibbon's Decline and Fall. Sixth, individuals can make a difference. Individuals like Henry Brougham, founder of the Crucial Society for the Diffusion of Crucial Knowledge, and they've often made a huge personal contribution by work, but so has financial giving by individual philanthropists in support of classical education. A great example is the celebrated Dick bequest, established by James Dick, a shoemaker's son, who yet made a fortune, and in 1828 left £114,000 to train school teachers in the shires of Aberdeen, Banff and Moray. And that important bequest strengthened the connection between the Eastern Parish schools and the universities of Aberdeen. Another great example is the will left by Edmund Harris, which allowed the Preston Corporation to set up a library, museum and art gallery absolutely suffused with classical materials and art to honour the memory of Harris's father, a self-made man. Seventh, we found plenty of evidence for the practical skills that the classics gave to people, not only inspiring their imaginations and cultural literacy, but citizenship skills, the power of argumentation and verbal expression, and just two examples make this clear. One is that the rhetorical training of large numbers of Methodists was based on classical oratory. At Oxford, John Wesley had studied Ciceronian oratory, but he was convinced that his non-ordained male and female preachers, many of whom had hardly any previous education, would benefit from hands-on training in the principles of classical rhetoric. He enthusiastically supervised the training himself, and he told them all to read between 6 and 8 hours a day, and recommended that they study not only scripture, but Hebrew, Greek, philosophy, secular history, ancient history, and science. He insisted that they learn from the Dutch scholar and theologian Gerard Vossius's introduction to Aristotelian rhetoric, the fundamental classical rhetorical precepts of deportment, appropriateness, sublimity, force, relevance, and brevity. And the curriculum of the miners and preachers' children, who he educated at Kingswood, the school he founded near Bristol, also included ancient Greek and, in their case, Latin. He modelled their education after his own, claiming, "Whoever carefully goes through this course will be a better scholar than 9 in 10 of the graduates of Oxford or Cambridge." The other example of skills is that there was an epidemic of plays on Caractacus, inspired by Tacitus, and performed in Edwardian Welsh schools in both Welsh and English. And the headmaster of Abergele School reports that the initiative had increased not only interest in history and the ancient history of Wales, but it also enhanced the standard of intelligence in everyone. There's a new zest, not only in history but in other studies. It's as though the children's outlook had been suddenly broadened and their intelligent appreciation of facts quickened. The 8th point is that government LEA policy helps, but we need to lobby today from government in the forms of legislation for educational policy and funding. The comparative richness of Scottish classical education historically went right back to the Reformation, because that's when Protestant reformers identified children's education, free education, as the instrument that could produce literate but godly citizens. And they tried to bring in a national school system centrally administered by the Kirk, masterminded by John Knox. Some working poor could now enter the schools and even learn Latin, occasionally Greek, since there were systems in place for their fees to be covered. And much later, Elizabeth Lipp of Morrisshire was the very first girl from the northeast of Scotland to train as a certified teacher, but that was only as a beneficiary of the landmark Education Scotland Act of 1872. And there she studied subjects including Latin, and Caesar and Virgil were her set texts, and Alexander Adams' Roman Antiquities. She was an innkeeper's daughter, but nevertheless got employment as a teacher in a highly respected Stornoway school after achieving the coveted Certificate of Competence. And finally, someone I'm researching now is the Victorian Edwardian educationalist Frederick Gould, and he's author of The Children's Plutarch. And he succeeded in getting classical myth and history a compulsory place in the London School Board's primary curriculum. 9th, universities can and should step up. Extramural and extension schemes from the late 19th century in Cambridge, London, Leeds, Oxford and elsewhere as well. Outstandingly, Durham were very successful. John Guy was a sacristan minor who studied Greek on a course set up by the NUM, and he took classes with the Durham Board of Extramural Studies. At Durham too, a Yorkshire miner's daughter called Barbara Taylor got a scholarship to read Latin at university. We need to foster much more joined up thinking between primary, secondary and tertiary institutions. And my last point, 10, is this. Alongside our inspiring stories, our research into memoirs confronted us with the terrible pain that being deprived of access to culture and classics inflicted on some working men. The Chartist poet Samuel Bamford believed this deprivation had arrested his intellectual development. A poet, a campaigner for universal suffrage, he identified the very moment at which he was formally excluded from learning classical languages as the opposite of a turning point. It was the event that determined he would stay labouring class forever. He'd come top of the senior English class, and that was at his local parish school, would normally have expected to advance into the Latin class, but his father refused to allow it. Ben Tillett, trade unionist and former MP, now over 70 years old, recalled in the 1830s working in the London docks in the late 19th century. He'd realised the need to acquire conventional education when the harshness of life in the East End persuaded him to become a Labour evangelist, but he felt very ill-equipped. Before I could enter upon that stage of my career, he wrote, there were areas of education to make up. I had much to learn as well as much to forget. Because a native of Bristol, Tillett had been labouring in a brickyard at the age of 8. And one paragraph of his memoirs starkly evokes the exhaustion induced by work. As a docker, I tried to save money. I starved to buy books. I was struggling to learn Latin. I was even trying to study Greek, lending my head, my aching body, to the task of my day's work on the dockside or on the tea warehouse where I was employed. And that meant carrying tons on my back up and down flights of stairs. If I have one grouch against the world rather than any other, the lack of opportunity for acquiring that kind of education in my early days is that one big grouch. So the British working classes were almost universally excluded from institutionalised classics and from study of ancient languages, but a few did overcome the obstacles. Many more engaged with the ancient Greeks and Romans in myriad creative ways. The classical world aided their careers, expanded their horizons, improved their rhetoric, informed their politics, alleviated their boredom, inspired them to read, write, paint, draw, sculpt, act, perform, teach, publish, organise trade unions, join debating societies, read the Gospels in the original, and question the existence of God altogether. They used classics to prove their intellectual calibre, to express their plight. They also used it to undermine the authority of the classes that had oppressed them and to entertain themselves during leisure hours. The heroes of British people's classics that we have met were gardeners, stonemasons, circus acrobats, factory operatives, engravers, cutlers, domestic servants, brewers, weavers, tramps, beggars, prisoners, thieves, inmates of mental hospitals, plasterers, painter decorators, cabin boys, milkmaids, washerwomen, wool sorters, drummers, butchers, grocers, mechanics, grooms, carpenters, errand boys, tailors, pill sellers, janitors, porters, dockers, hatters, fishermen, sailor, comb makers, bakers, bricklayers, navvies, shepherds, threshers and grave diggers. And I think they deserve to be given honoured places in the gallery of classics for all because they struggled so hard to get access to the ancient world. But they also offer us a glorious new ancestral backstory for subject matter that still stands in some need of being made more accessible. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderfully rich talk, which I'm sure obeyed all Vossius's rhetorical precepts.
I try.
There were nearly 150 of us listening to you then, and I'm hopeful that one or two more will offer me some questions which I can pass on to you. But I'm going to start very quickly with an apology. I think it was because of so many Scottish examples in your talk that I confused St Andrews with Athens. So
Fair enough.
I'm very sorry for degrading you in that way. Okay, my first question, Edith. you put in the subtitle of your book, class. Could you very briefly, because there are many competing definitions and usages of class, how you mainly wish us to understand your application of that term?
Okay, this is laid out in some detail in chapter 1. I use it actually as an objective criterion. That is, people who have, the working classes are people who have no inherited capital, who have absolutely no chance of survival if they don't sell their own labour. I'm not so interested in subjective definitions, which are about appearances, hobbies, habits, the way people identify people. I'm talking about people's position in the economic system, and therefore, until the Great Reformist Education Acts in the 1880s and onwards, had absolutely no chance at any kind of proper education over the age of 8. So it's an objective category about lack of access to either leisure to study, because you've got to go down the mine for 12 hours a day, or to money for the kind of education that might get you out of that economic plight.
Thanks very much indeed. Then rather different one. What the hell is critical lateral relativist thinking?
Oh, Paul. Well, I actually think this is something that the Greeks and Romans can really do for us. Critical is easy. One of the great things about the classical civilization courses is that we get multiple sources on the same event, right? So that we get Thucydides and Cleon and Aristophanes on Cleon, right? Now, they may be quite similar, but loads of other occasions we get a real critical debate. We get tragedians saying that women must be silent, and then we get the Lysistrata. So that's critical. Cultural relativism is one of the great things about teaching classics and studying classics for young people, is that the more different the society and the more safely it is in the past, the easier it is to address really thorny issues like race, sexuality, and gender. I've personally been present with the option for classical civilization on love and so on, talking about the symposium, and I have got people from incredibly conservative Christian, Muslim, Hindu backgrounds all discussing homosexuality. So that's cultural relativism. What was the other one you didn't like?
Lateral.
Lateral. Okay. So that would mean being able to come in at a concept like democracy, just as you do, in a way that excludes no other kinds of cultures, that doesn't flatten out different definitions of that, either on a synchronic, that is plain today, people use the word democracy all over the world in different ways, or transhistorically. So classics gives you this opportunity to study the way words are used in one culture and examine very critically how they're used in ours, and come to an understanding that things don't always horizontally or laterally mean exactly the same thing.
Excellent answers. Thank you very much for both those. Then I've got one last one. You mentioned translations, and of course, a lot of the stuff that you were talking about was being read in translation, though with the aim of leading people to study the original Greek or Latin. Is there a particular work or a particular translation of a particular work, the equivalent, let us say, of Pope, that you would recommend for somebody starting off? I started reading Homer aged 8 in a Told to the Children version of the Odyssey, which I think was a brilliant choice. It was quite accidental, but is there something that you would yourself recommend in that line?
Oh, heavens, richness of
choice, yeah.
Of choice. I mean, I think the I'm a bit woozy because of anesthetic yesterday, but I think the great Penguin Odyssey translation by, you see, here we go.
E.V. Rieu.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Review, which revolutionized how people talked about reading the ancient world, because it's written like this very lively novel.
Yeah.
That would be a very, very good. And you know, my aunt, who was a botanist and had absolutely no interest in arts and humanity, that was the one classic she had read in the 1950s. Right, that's the sort of thing. That would be one example. And the other would be the great Herodotus. Sorry, Paul, you'll be able to remember the name. I'm just feeling very woozy.
By de Selincourt?
Absolutely. Aubrey de Selincourt's Herodotus. This is by somebody who is actually a traveler, a war correspondent, and got the excitement of Herodotus in ways that none of his Victorian translators ever had. So you want to find someone you find utterly gripping as a writer and go there. For Greek tragedy, I would always say Tony Harrison, as you know.
Oh yeah, poet and of course a classicist, Leeds grammar. Well, you say you're feeling woozy. I'm very sorry about that. My Greek doctor friend has sent you a message, Spiros Retsas. He wishes you tachia anarosi, so speedy recovery. Or
well, funnily enough, my anaesthetist was called Ioannis Christodoulidis. And just as I went under, I said something about ancient Greeks were very interested in optics, but I said it in Greek. And my last hazy thing is some weird discussion of Ptolemy's optics.
Yikes. Okay, well, we won't go there.
All right.
I'm going to slip in.
Okay.
Happy birthday, classics student James.
Oh, gosh.
How about that? Now I'm going to move on to the first of the questions sent in by a member of the audience, Anthony Bainbridge. He wonders whether the diversity of modern life and the many more options available to modern youngsters than were available to earlier generations make it more difficult to maintain the attraction of classics beyond school years. In other words, we've started them off through classics for all. How do we keep their interest up later?
I personally haven't found it so hard to keep it up. I mean, I teach completely free online a whole group of London pensioners, A-level Greek, and I've got them queuing up at the door to do this, provided it's free because they're very poor. That's exactly what they want to do. But I understand the question, and I think really what we need is a real public understanding. You know, there've been 6 human revolutions. There has been cognitive, when we all stood up and started talking, agricultural, when we built cities. Then we had jump classics, we had printing, industrial and digital. But the one that formed the utter total inside of our intellectual minds happened between about 800 BCE and about 400 CE. And anybody who leaves school without knowing how the inside of our brains was organized by classical disciplines is not going to be able to get the modern world. And it's an incredibly fertile seam that I think can keep people happily and responsibly engaged in their leisure hours from 18 to 128.
Thank you very much. Then this is partly a question, partly a comment that someone has found, Robin Hughes, following on a review of your book by one of our colleagues. You persuasively show that in the past, from the 17th to the 20th century, people outside the elite have found studying, reading ancient Greek and Roman material beguiling, exciting, etc., etc. But merely by pointing out that classics has not always been or entirely ever been a preserve of the upper class or the middle class, how do you then go on to answer the objection that the elite, however you like to define that, does sometimes try to use classics as a kind of class weapon against non-elite persons?
Well, I don't personally feel the need to answer that because I spent my entire life opposing it, and spent my entire life since I was an undergraduate collecting evidence that shows just how inspirational and useful this kind of material can be to people who aren't elite. So I personally don't feel I have to apologize. I'm not quite sure how to take that particular criticism. Either we say, okay, let's dump the whole caboodle, let's never study the Greeks and Romans because some bad guys got hold of it. Yeah. There've been loads of bad guys who've used classics in all absolutely appalling ways, from the Confederates in before the Civil War in America to Adolf Hitler. I mean, absolutely, because it's so precious. Because it's so precious, I think it's an indication of its value culturally. So do we either say, well, sorry, we're not going to ever study this because the bad guys got hold of it, or are we going to say, actually, we're going to fight like hell for its use for progressive causes and world democracy?
Thanks very much. Then I've got a question here from Georgina Johnson. I'm having to be very selective because quite a few have now come in, some of which, by the way, are relating their personal experiences of classics.
I want to hear those.
I know,
guys,
absolutely. But the question...
Guys, email me via my website. I want to hear those experiences. I really want to hear all the personal experiences. So go into edith.hall.co.uk and email me, please.
And let me just jump in there, Edith. Your blog is utterly wonderful and people should be aware of Edithorial, absolutely worth consulting. Georgina's question is, given that the pandemic has widened the educational gap between the disadvantaged and the non-disadvantaged among school children, teachers need therefore to prioritize what to teach once conditions become slightly more normal. What place do you think classics should have in educational recovery?
Well, I would like it to be absolutely central. If I were, head of educational policy in Britain, I would insist on people in about year 9 having an entire year of what you need to know about the ancient world in order to get jobs, convince people to employ you, get innovational, all of the rest of it. It's unbelievably difficult. The government is in general emphasizing STEM subjects and so on, but let's turn the problem into an opportunity. I have been so touched and impressed by the way that classics colleagues at every level have embraced the internet over the last 15 months. It is incredible what you can find out there. Classics for All is very good at coordinating that. So I hope is my project ACE. And let's not see it as a problem, but as an opportunity to go forward. I hope next year to start doing, I'm going to do an entire series of 2-year course for A-level classical civilization, completely free online 3 times a week.
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's just take this not as a problem, but as an opportunity and forge ahead.
So we're pressing up against the time limit and I've just got time for one last one. This comes from Christopher Clark, who is a fellow member with me of the Development Committee of Classics for All. And he makes the point first that Classics for All has always been strongly apolitical. Yet, and now yet he goes on, your thesis about working class education accessibility of the classics clearly underpins the current government's policy of levelling up. What more do you think needs to be done practically to get our message across to policy makers and their advisors? Studying classics has a key role to play, not just in education in the narrow sense, but also in facilitating social mobility.
Well, I do think classics is one of the greatest keys to facilitating social mobility, and I hope my talk made that clear. I want the government to put some money where their mouth is. We have a prime minister who keeps telling everybody how wonderful classics is, but he came through the private system where only 7% of our kids are. And this charity is absolutely wonderfully and properly committed to the other 93%. So we need the government to put some money where its mouth is. We need to have some actual money put behind classical civilization, ancient history, as well as Latin and Greek, because they are easier to roll into state schools because you don't need somebody with a PGC in classics to do so. And we also need to get classical civilization made equivalent to ancient history on the International Baccalaureate. All of these things I know that Classics for All is campaigning for incredibly hard, as am I and Dr. Arlene Holmes-Anderson, my co-leader of the Advocating Classics Education programme. I tried to indicate in my talk that we need not only individual benefactions, but real grip on policy. I tried to outline 10 steps forward because they were 10 steps that the past teaches us, and I hope I've done that.
You've done absolutely brilliantly, especially in your particular medical circumstances. We're deeply grateful to you, Edith. We move on now to the final segment of this event, and you have helped, just before I move on to that, by attending, you've helped to support our work of increasing access to classics to those school children who are being educated through the state or maintained sector. We're now going to be joined by Classics for All's Programs Director, Hilary Hodgson, and by Gemma Williams, a teacher, as I said before, from Allerton Grange, a state secondary school in Leeds, who introduced GCSE and A-level Class Civ to her school with our support, with support from Classics for All. Now, audience members are welcome to leave now if they so wish, but of course I hope that you do not so wish, and I hand over to Hilary.
Well, hello everybody, and thank you, Edith, for a fantastically inspiring talk, which I think echoes our core mission perfectly in terms of creating equal access in the 21st century to classics, which is, after all, what we're all here to celebrate. There is a long way to go, but I've got with me today Gemma Williams, who's from Allerton Grange, as Paul said, which is a school in an inner city comprehensive school in Leeds. And since 2017, Gemma, who's joining us, she's introduced both classical civilization at GCSE and A-level against the odds in a very, what some of the political elite would probably call a bog standard comprehensive. So I'm going to take the opportunity to talk to her for a wee bit about how she's done that and how we, both Edith and ACE and CFA, have helped her in that mission. So Gemma, just starting with the question, I mean, back in 2017, and you're in inner city Leeds, what was the kind of outlook and prospect like for classics in an ordinary state maintained school?
There was practically no provision of classics at all in Leeds back in 2017. Despite Leeds being the 4th largest city in the UK, we only had 2 sixth form colleges offering classics, Class Civ at A-level, and that was it. There was nothing else available in the city. Right.
So, but you're a history teacher. Okay, so I'm trying to get a grip on this. You're a history teacher. What prompted you to introduce classics? Because there would be pressure, perhaps, just for you to stick to modern history.
And so the school that I went to an ordinary comprehensive in Halifax, like a very working class town. And my school offered classics and Latin from year 7, 8 and 9. And then I did Class Civ at GCSE and A-level and went to do my degree in classics. And to me, it was just a regular subject. And I thought every single school did it. Got to university, found that almost everyone in my course was privately educated, and really felt almost like I wasn't worthy because I come from that comprehensive school. And I always knew I wanted to be a teacher, but when I graduated, there just wasn't a job available for me as a classics teacher in the North, let alone any training, any PGC courses in the North at all. So I ended up as a history teacher for 6 years, but it never ever left me that I really wanted to be a classics teacher. And I was desperate to find a school that would make the very bold choice to let me introduce it. And my school, Allerton Grange, have such high ambition for our students, and our whole curriculum is underpinned. We call it our class curriculum because it's underpinned by knowledge, literacy, social mobility and aspiration. And classics fits in absolutely perfectly with that vision of our school and what we want our students to achieve. And so because my background is, and I am a classicist, even though I did my PGC in history, my school were willing to let me set up a classics department.
Well, you sound as if you're a campaigner. I mean, a fantastic campaigner, and I can't imagine anybody demurring or stopping you doing what you want to do. But given that the school had no tradition of classics teaching, despite your passion, how the heck did you manage to persuade your senior leadership team to do this? What was the process, and how did you get them on board?
I wrote them a huge proposal that was about 20 pages long and just convinced them that it was absolutely worth it. So I really laid out for them exactly what classics was, and much like all the things Edith's just discussed with us, like how powerful classics can be as a tool for social mobility and how much of a fantastic opportunity it would be for our students. I underpinned how it linked to our school values. I did a student voice where I asked questions across different year groups about what did they think of this subject? Did they even know what it was? They didn't. But as soon as I explained to them what classics was, they were like, that sounds brilliant. Why don't we do that subject? I was like, well, I'm trying. But I also had to cover things like who would teach it. And luckily it was very easy to say me. But you're right, I did have to explain who would teach my history hours and how it would fit on the timetable, how I would get money, and listed all of you wonderful organisations of where I could apply for funding to, and just wrote this proposal to them with such gusto that they went for it instantly.
That's fantastic. And I remember coming up to Leeds, and you were so full of passion at the ACE conference in Leeds, and so determined to do it. How did parents respond? I mean, you'd obviously got the senior
They love it.
They love it. Yeah.
Yeah. You find a lot of people who, because say we're now one of the only schools in Leeds, but we didn't used to be. Classics and Latin used to be in so many schools. And as there's been government and policy changes to education, more schools have really felt forced to drop classics over the kind of last 30 years. So I speak to parents all the time who did classics or Latin at school, and they didn't think that their child would have the opportunity to learn it. So when they find out that we offer it, they're really excited about that.
Yeah. And what about the pupils? Because you've now got, I'm amazed that you've got both kind of GCSE plus Civ and A level within 3 years, 4 years on the curriculum. Are the numbers holding up? And are the pupils as enthusiastic as they were in your first student kind of consultation? Are they getting a kick out of the subject? Are they moving on to uni? How are they reacting? What is it doing in their terms for them?
They love it. And we have a really great time in our lessons, and they work so hard because they absolutely love the subject. So every year our numbers keep getting better for GCSE and A level. We have had, so in 2020, it should have been our first cohort sitting their exams. But of that cohort, more than half of them went on to study classics at A level. This year in the class, 80% of them are staying on and doing it at A level as well. From the A level classes, we've had in the last 2 years, more than half of the students who have studied A level have gone to university to do classics degrees. And there's become such a buzz about classics at the school that in September, we're rolling out classics to Key Stage 3. So in September, our entire Year 7 cohort, which is over 300 students, will learn classics. So we'll have an hour of classics every week.
And that is key, isn't it? Key Stage 3.
Yeah, so we're really hoping that the numbers at GCSE and A level are just going to grow even more as we have all these Key Stage 3 students taking classics.
And for those in the audience who don't know what Key Stage 3 is, it's the area of the curriculum between Year 7, 11 to 14, before you've made your options, but there is no classics curriculum. So we have to stealthily insinuate classics into English and history in order to make them feel that they want to take it at GCSE or A level. So that's an incredibly important piece of the jigsaw. So doubtless you'll have double the numbers in 2 or 3 years' time. So, I mean, what about how have I suppose, you know, ACE and Classics for All helped you to get there? I mean, it's important that people understand what we do as a charity. So what would you say the things that we've offered you have? How have we helped you to succeed in your mission?
So initially, I found ACE, and they were absolutely brilliant, firstly, at just giving me so much guidance and support with what I was doing, but also guiding me in the direction of where I could get funding. So introducing me to Classics for All and other charities who could help me and who could offer me support in setting this up. So I applied to Classics for All for some funding before I'd even taught my first classics class, and I was successful in getting some of that funding. And one of the biggest things it did for me was to improve my subject knowledge, because even though I'm a classicist, I'd spent 6 years as a history teacher. It had been almost a decade since I finished my classics degree. So with the funding that I got from Classics for All, I was able to go on lots of CPD courses. I was able to go on courses with OCR to learn about the specification for GCSE and A level. I was able to get myself lots of books to improve my subject knowledge, as well as purchase Massalit to be able to really engage with academics because of the scholarship side of the A level. And at the Classics for All Northern Hub, they've been incredible. So Maria Haley, who organises the Leeds Hub, she's done so much for Allerton Grange. Before the courses started, she came into school and she helped me with promotional events. She did sixth form open evenings with me to get students interested, because there was only me doing this, and it was good to have that second pair of hands to speak to people. Since we've started the course, Maria has come in. She has run seminars with the A-level students. She has also come in and helped with our Latin club after school. And that was another thing that Classics for All helped me with when I wanted to start up a Latin after school club. They helped me to source some of the Cambridge Latin course books and to buy some Latin dictionaries that we could use. And what was the last thing? Oh yeah, Maria has also helped to organise trips with us. So she helped us organise a trip at Leeds University so that A-level students could do coin handling sessions of Roman coins. So for me, Classics for All have just been absolutely incredible at helping establish classics in our school.
Well, that's what we want to do, and long may it exist. So if there's any more support you need with your Key Stage 3, we're there. And I think that the modus operandi of Classics for All is to help people in the way that they want to be helped. You know, it's not a blueprint. We're terribly tailored in the support that we give. One very quick, because I'm aware of time, last question, and Paul may then have a couple of questions from the audience or not. But what next, Gemma, besides Key Stage 3? Are you busy promulgating and advocating classics across Leeds? Are we going to get some more schools in? Your primary school?
I'm so hopeful that we will. I really want more schools in Leeds to take up classics. We've thankfully now got a skit for classics running in Leeds.
What's a skit? Gemma, you're talking to
sorry, a teacher training programme for people to study to become classics teachers. So there's going to be more classics teachers coming out of Leeds. So we do want to encourage more schools to introduce classics. Hopefully we want to work with our primary schools and try and help them to introduce classics or Latin into their curriculum. So that'd be incredible then when the students come to us in year 7. We've got year 7 starting in September, but then in 2022 we'll go into year 8, and in 2023 we're going to go into year 9. So we've got 1,500 students in our school, and we continue to grow. So by 2023, all 1,500 students will study classics.
And if that isn't an inspiring message for everybody out there, I don't know what is. And I love your passion. And a big shout out as well to the 17 regional networks that we have, one of which is run by Maria Haley in Leeds, on 1 day a week, and look at the work she does. It's fantastic. Over to you, Paul.
Well, yes, I was absolutely fascinated by that last Q&A. I mentioned, as Edith had, Tony Harrison. He is a loiner, and as well as the most extraordinary poet dramatist. So he went to Leeds Grammar. Something about Leeds, obviously, something in the water that conduces to classics. Gemma, I can think of no more articulate or inspiring champion of classics in the state schools than yourself. Thank you so much for coming on. Hilary, you were brilliant to discover Gemma and ask her the right questions. And so for me, it's just to wrap up and say thank you all for attending. Thanks to Edith for really heroically, I think, coming out after so soon after a difficult operation. And I hope everyone feels as I do, that this has been a most worthwhile event. And I'm personally already looking forward to our next one. And all the very best to everybody concerned. May you be well and safe, and think of classics for all, and remember us in your prayers. Bye for now.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks, Edith. Brilliant. Thank you.
Bye for now.